At the end of the war, 20,000 civilians were executed and more died in concentration camps. Several thousands of them in Nazi concentration camps. As well, we can talk about this later during the drinks. But then we started 40 years of repression, and Franco's regime was actually based on the elimination of all sorts of opposition, ideological, political, religious opposition. So mostly of those who had been sympathizing with the regime, with the democratic regime, but at every single sphere, including civil servants, teachers, lecturers, especially the repression against teachers was very important. It was an attempt to actually erase every memory of the previous regime and to rebuild a memory, rewrite history, and write history from the perspective of those who won the war and from the perspective of a new Catholic and fascist state. There was the prosecutions were terrible. There was a general cause called the general cause against every single sympathizer of the old regime, civil servant, public official, homosexuals, Jews, gypsies. So the jails were filled up with people, and those who were in terrible conditions, and that, some of them that have described here of torture, sexual violations. And sickness, infections, terrific accounts that resemble some of the ones that we've heard here. But those who stayed outside had to suffer the lack of access to public jobs, the incapacity for their children, and we've heard this, to access education, to access the specific status of society. And also 80% of the jobs were reserved for those sympathizers of the regime, and specifically those considered very religious and that had a good relationship with their the church. There was so during the Franco times, actually, there was a re-victimization. The victims of the civil war on the Republican side were not even allowed to have a statute of victims, while the victims of Franco's side were actually rehabilitated, compensations were established, monuments. They were the ones that were buried in mass graves were taken out, identified, given proper burial, whilst the mothers, wives, daughters of those fallen during the Republic, for the Republic were the victimized, marginalized, and struggled to survive. Franco's repression was based on the manipulation of history. This is very important to understand the transition. And the new regime invented a new official discourse of its own victory as a crusade against evil, and evil was all of those that weren't religious, that were communist, that were Jews or Masonry. 40 years in which the population lived in a state of indoctrination and imposed memory. In those years, those who lost the war did not talk about the war. They did not talk about the repression, and the two generations of Spaniards learned to whisper and look after, over their shoulder when talking. The transition started when Franco died, and very quickly, I'll just focus on this pact of silence that has been so well considered until recently in the international literature, and how a model of transition in which we all came together and we reconciled through, looking ahead. Looking ahead was very pressing. The country was in a terrible state of economic after 40 years of isolation. The new generation who wanted to do this process wanted to actually become part of Europe. The possibility of getting into the European Union was very important, and the European community at the time. And they wanted to be modern, wanted economic development, wanted not to live in such oppression anymore. So this idea of the pact, that there was a consensus of impunity, that it was what the whole community wanted, the whole society wanted. It's actually it's been very manipulated, very exalted, and some analysts have talked about the fear of a new conflict, a big sense of guilt that the whole society, both bands had, which was very much re-enhanced by Franco's revisited of history, of how terrible the Republican side violations had been. And there was travel times, there was lots of terrorist activity at the time. And basically this second generation had suffered so much to seeing their parents being oppressed and their parents being so sorry for themselves and for their children that were completely focused on continuing their economic development. The truth is that during the transition there was no claims for justice. Any suggestion was immediately tagged as revanchist or a revenge by the right wing and not timely by the left wing. So this is the idea, it's like, it's not the time, it's not the time. Well, when is the time? And it seems that it is the time now. However, now it's too late for some people. And is it too late for Spanish society as a whole? The one very important issue to understand why transitional justice measures have taken so long and why they have not claimed for justice in courts of criminal justice is the fact that there was no vetting. The public officials during Franco regime remained during the transition. Some of the political leaders are still in political parties. The president of the Pepe was the Popular Party, was the minister during Franco, in charge of some of the terrible repressions, and he still has some prominent role. So the people who were the repressors actually stayed in the main positions of power, but also stayed in the judiciary, stayed in the police, stayed in the military. There were doctors. They were, whilst the rest of the people had not access to these kinds of professions. So just very quickly, just to say, there have been, in the 2 minutes that I have, there have been measures. These measures were until 2007, drop by drop, little by little, rehabilitation of victims, the establishing of new compensation schemes for victims. It wasn't until the late 90s and the 2000s that actually one individual started looking for his grandfather. And he wanted to know where his grandfather was buried. He had heard that he was shot, extrajudicially killed, and shot and left at the side of the road. And he started a search for his grandfather that ended up in thousands of searches, ended up with Spanish society shocked by opening of mass graves, by seeing scalps with bullets, by seeing the remains of the civilians, and starting to hearing the victims. It was in 2007 that the Spanish government passed, led by the president who was the grandchild of one of those extrajudicially killed, that passed a historical memory law, and it's called historical memory law, and it's very much has transformed this idea of transitional justice into memory, but historical memory. It's a rehabilitation of the victims through memory, but not through prosecutions, and not through, for example, one of the things that victims want is for the establishment of those judicial sentences that put them in jail and kept their families in jail for years to actually be considered unlawful, and this hasn't happened, for example. So there are very lots of technical issues just come from Spain, from endless debates about amnesties cannot be derogated. This would be against legal security, so we can't prosecute. The crimes against humanity weren't a crime in the 30s, therefore we can't apply them, etc., etc. That, as we heard, took Garzón to lose his position and actually be in The Hague in exile, we could say. So I just want to say, so that this is, in a way, the transition of the grandchildren. It's this generation that want to know what happened to their grandparents, that want to know why their grandmother whispers and looks around every time she says something that is not even controversial. So maybe it's this generation, my generation, that has this capacity, because we're looking for answers to what happened, but who we are and why we are how we are. So the argument of those who claim that it's too late to open all wounds is a manipulative argument, in my opinion. Deprives the victims from their dignity, and us, the Spaniards and the international community, of part of our history and therefore of our identity. There is no risk of a new conflict. There are only bodies of the side of the road without being identified, families who were dispossessed of their role in society and the opportunity for economic and professional development, and much suffering which has not had enough public recognition. Thank you.
Olga, for highlighting some of the determination that it takes to pursue accountability for serious human rights violations. And I think it's a determination that we've definitely seen in the room here today. Our last speaker for this evening is one of Oxford Transitional Justice Research's own members. Francesca Lessa is a research assistant at the Latin American Center and has done fascinating doctoral work on how Argentina and Uruguay have confronted past evils. And it's in that context that she'll provide some comparative insight into accountability and acknowledgement of serious human rights violations.
Thank you, Nikki, and I wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me here, but also giving me two very difficult tasks. The first being the last speaker of the day, and after all the contribution, it's going to be really hard to say something as interesting or as powerful after everything that has been said. And the second challenge is to summarize 30 years of transitional justice, not just in one country, Argentina, which is considered as one of the leaders of transitional justice, but also Uruguay. That is a case that is generally left out from many studies. But just to give you an anecdote, as we are gathered here today, the Uruguayan House, the Senate House of the Uruguayan Parliament, is meeting today to vote to derogate the amnesty law relating to the crimes of the dictatorship. So it's just a small anecdote to say that many things have also happened in Uruguay. So what I'm going to try to do in this 10 minutes is to summarize 3 decades of transitional justice in Argentina and Uruguay, and try to highlight the different cycles of prosecutions, truth, amnesty, impunity, and again, prosecutions, truth, and challenges to amnesty laws. And finally, just to conclude, is to try to highlight some of the lessons and some of the possible avenues that could be followed in the Iran case. And as some of the panelists were mentioning before, you need to be creative and persistent in this quest for justice. And I think both Argentina and Uruguay do show that you need to be exactly that, because they've really overcome many obstacles that just 20 years ago were probably thought to be impossible to overcome. So creativity was really important in both of these cases. Just to give a very brief historical background for those of you that are not familiar with the cases of Argentina and Uruguay, these are just 2 cases in a regional context of military dictatorships that took place roughly from the mid-50s to the late 1980s. And at the time you had dictatorships in Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil as well, and Peru later on. So these dictatorships were part of a framework of the global Cold War. And at the time, the Cold War was not just being fought in the international sphere, but inside each of these countries, you had the fight against communism, in particular the internal subversives that the military government were arbitrarily kidnapping, torturing, and in the case of Argentina in particular, disappearing. And in addition to these violations of civil and political rights, you also had a political and ideological repression, especially in the case of Uruguay. For about 15 years, you had over 10,000 people that were deprived of political rights. All trade union activities were suspended. You had a very widespread censorship.